The Legend of Korra is constantly being talked about as a borderline trash show, and to be honest, the people that say that must be watching a different series than I am, because even with some of its shortcomings, I still think Korra is a very high quality show, and I would recommend any fans of Avatar: The Last Airbender who haven't seen it in its entirety to do so. And today, I want to discuss some of the unfair criticisms of the series and try to explore how the Legend of Korra functions. And there will be some minor spoilers throughout this video. The first thing I want to discuss is the sky-high expectations for the series. I don't think high expectations are a bad thing at all. Personally, Avatar is one of my top 10 favorite shows of all time, and very well could be in the top 5. So when it comes to a sequel series, of course I want it to be good. However, the expectations for Korra have transformed from hoping the series is of a good quality to wanting it to be the exact same as The Last Airbender, with many criticisms coming down to things like, well, I like Sokka and Katara more than Mako and Bolin. And yeah, I get it, that Korra's cast isn't nearly as iconic because the focus of the story is not as character-driven, but thematically driven instead. So while I think it's totally fair to expect the series to be of a good quality, and I will be the first to admit that I think The Last Airbender is a better show, I don't think we should expect Korra to give us the same feeling that the original series did, and instead try to judge Korra on what it gave us versus what it could have given us. Quickly, on the note of what we could have gotten, I constantly see arguments on Twitter about how Korra should have focused on Team Avatar after the events of the last series, and that the story would have been better because of that. And I think that is some pretty wishful thinking. I know I can think of a few series where iconic characters were brought back under different direction, and fan bases absolutely tore them apart for ruining their favorite characters. And while I think for the most part that's kind of a silly criticism of that new series, it does show that just because you bring back iconic characters from the past, that doesn't guarantee that the series will be good. For one, I know that I'm happy that we got The Legend of Korra, mainly because of how much I like Korra as a character. I know a lot of people don't think Korra is a particularly great protagonist, and to be honest, I have a hard time sympathizing with that point of view because, well, she really makes the series for me. I think many people might get off on the wrong foot with Korra because of the way she is introduced. Unlike Aang, Korra is pretty much a prodigy when we first see her, and we only spend a short amount of time with her struggling to learn the elements. I can see where people come from when they first lay eyes on the series, because they might be looking for a new Aang within Korra instead of looking at Korra as her own character. Personally, I love the way that she is introduced. Being a hard-nosed lead female character is a pretty great message to send, where her flaws as a character are not what you would typically prescribe to a female lead. She speaks out for what she believes in and is willing to get her hands dirty for her cause. Even though when Korra is first introduced, she doesn't really understand all of the political nuances to the opinions that she has, by the end of the series, she is a competent leader who knows exactly who she is, and is also in a position of power to help other people who are in less fortunate situations succeed. When comparing Korra and Aang started the series with an immense amount of trauma because of his backstory. The fact that he left his people behind. When we meet Korra, she hasn't gone through any of that, so her trauma comes after she faces down with many of the villains, and this is shown brilliantly through how the Avatar state is used throughout the series. In The Last Airbender, Aang couldn't control the Avatar state, not because he wasn't strong enough, but because he hadn't come to terms with who he was as a person. At the start of the series, Korra is about as sure-footed as you could possibly be, so it makes sense that she would be able to unlock the Avatar state quickly. However, as the series goes forward, Korra starts to doubt what she believes and who she is, and because of that, she loses her access to the Avatar state, showing her trauma. Again, having Aang's backstory at the start and Korra's happening throughout the course of the series is not a criticism of either, but just highlighting how they both function. Another criticism that I hear all the time is the structure of the series, how every single season doesn't directly lead into the next, and while that is kind of true for the first half of the series, I also think it just misses the point at the purpose of the structure for this specific story. In my Why the Avatar The Last Airbender is Great series, I argued that trauma within characters is what moved the series forward, and for Korra, I think that same thing can be said for social injustices. While many of the conflicts in The Last Airbender started inward with each individual character, the conflicts in Korra are outward from the structures of society itself. The villains in the series are basically just leaders of social movements, and with the political climate that we see today, it shows how the structure of Korra reflects how political movements actually feel. Far too often, a movement is set in motion because of wrongful actions from the people in power to that of a minority, and the reaction to that is protests and things of that nature. But the reason that we feel so little change is because after the protests go for a little while, everyone returns to their everyday lives and forgets it ever happened. Until the shock of an atrocity arises again a few months or years later, and the same thing happens again. And so the people who are in privileged situations have the ability to join a movement and then leave it just as quickly. And that is the same feeling that Korra betrays in its structure, especially early in the series. But as the structure evolves, the impact of each villain starts to weigh on Korra as a character, and the events of each season lead into the new villain. A grand sweeping adventure just wouldn't fit Korra's story in the same way that it does for The Last Airbender and Aang. Now, I do want to mention that Korra is without a doubt a flawed series and has many shortcomings. For example, I think Mako is by far the weakest character in the series. I don't think his characterization is strong enough, he has little development over the series, and he really just toys with Asami and Korra's hearts, and then becomes too scared to face them later in the show. He has maybe a few moments where he is likable at best, but I do think he drags down the show. Season 1 and 2 also have their shortcomings, as you can definitely tell that they're trying to find their footing with how they want to tackle this story. I think the first episode does a nice job at establishing the world and Korra as a character, but the pro-bending episodes are no doubt pretty rough. However, a few episodes after that, I feel like the series really starts to hit its stride, even if it does stumble a little bit in how it handles Amon at the end of Season 1. The second season has a really solid start, and I absolutely love the original Avatar episodes as a perfect example of expanding the lore of the world without giving us too much scientific detail as to how the fantasy world functions. I do think Season 2 has the weakest villain in the series, and that is what holds down Season 2 from being on the same level as the third and fourth season. And so I do admit there is a few moments in the first two seasons that doesn't really reach the quality that the last two seasons do, and because of that, I know a lot of people don't finish the series. But that line of thinking is a little odd to me because The Office is one of the most watched series in the world, and it notoriously has a terrible first season. Korra only has 2, maybe 3 rough episodes to start, and then it really picks up. Speaking of the second season, one of the aspects that is so interesting about season 2 is how Tenzin is handled. Tenzin at first seems like he's going to fit the role that Iroh did in the original series, but Tenzin actually goes through the series learning how to be a competent leader and mentor, not only to his kids and Korra, but to the whole new generation of airbenders. Tenzin showed that even when we get older, we still need to adapt to different ways of leading the new generations. Tenzin is my personal favorite character in the story, and even though overall I think the cast is weaker than The Last Airbender because there's just less focus put on that, I think Korra and Tenzin together are far worth watching the series because they are both amazing characters, super well written, have great progressions, and play well off of each other. So yes, Korra has some shortcomings. Like I said, I don't think it is as good as The Last Airbender, but the shortcomings are blown way out of proportion because of the legacy of its predecessor and some unfair criticism. I do think there's a valley of discussions that can be had pouring out of the Legend of Korra as to how social injustices should be handled and how those injustices influence citizens. Like I said earlier, the story of Korra is forced through external means, mainly through its 4 villains. And that's really where the series flexes its muscles, especially with Zahir in Season 3. Zahir is terrifying and profound all at the same time, and really the quality of his character and how he relates to Korra at the end of Season 3 it goes a long way in developing Korra as a great protagonist. Each villain pushes Korra in a different way through her ideology, culminating in her getting PTSD through the fights between them and through the ideological conflicts between her and the 3 first villains, leading to some of the best moments in the series at the beginning of Season 4. Showing how the outward pressures of different social movements and different conflicts that you have to go in will affect your mental state. Another example of how Korra tackles big ideas. The last piece of unfair criticism that I feel needs to be discussed is the romantic relationship at the end of the series between Korra and Asami. There is a large portion of people who argue that it takes away from making an actual statement about the inclusion of a queer character by only putting them in at the end of the series. And while I do think there is a little bit of truth to that claim, I still only believe that it is truly an issue because of homophobia and not because of how it is treated in the story. If you disagree with having an LGBTQ character in the series at all, then that is a non-starter. But if we discussed how it is approached in the series, then we can actually have a real conversation about it. I for sure wouldn't have minded some exploration of Korra and her feelings on the matter, but I also feel that there are moments in the last 2 seasons of the series with clear romantic tension between Korra and Asami that could easily lead them both wanting to get away from everyone and explore some romantic tension between them. Korra and Asami, as seen through their development throughout the series, are strong, independent people who really don't need to explain anyone their sexual preferences. It is the same reason that we needed no explanation at the beginning of the series as to why Korra would be interested in Mako. We also don't need that same explanation for Korra being bisexual. I strongly believe that it should not be the role of a member of the LGBTQ community to lecture someone outside of that community that they are in fact queer. Korra knew from a young age that she was the Avatar, and she has always been strong-willed about everything she has done. So I don't know why it would be so inconceivable for her to know that she is bisexual from a young age, and have her never really question it. Yes, she goes after Mako early in the series, but that shouldn't force her into being heterosexual. An important thing to note is that Korra has the most agency in the story, and Asami has a lot of agency as well. It may not have been the fleshed out relationship we wanted, because Korra is only 4 seasons, but making your 2 female leads in the series be bisexual does a hell of a lot more for diversity than, say, I don't know, putting a same-sex kiss in by 2 characters with no agency in the plot and calling that diversity inclusion. Korra shows that if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, that you don't need to lecture everyone on your sexuality, which is much better than what we got in Star Wars, where it is basically telling the people of the LGBTQ community that you will never have agency and you will always be in the background. Korra shows that you can be a member of the LGBTQ community and have agency. So that was my rant on The Legend of Korra, and even if it might not be a perfect show, it still holds the same maturity that The Last Airbender does, even with more missteps. If you haven't seen Korra, then I would highly recommend checking it out, and if you saw it a few years ago and didn't like it, I would say go give it a rewatch. I think you might be surprised at the quality of the story that it really is. I think The Legend of Korra is an incredibly mature show that tackles sophisticated themes on how social injustices are handled and how we can move forward as a society and how those issues can affect us internally. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.